that tree to move around water, and the host's defensive response to that issue. And I just kind of wanted to emphasize that here you've got a canker here, a nice target canker. You have some wilty leaves. And even though you're seeing the wilty leaves, in this case of laurel wilt disease, what's causing that is something that's in that vascular system that's restricting the water and causing that wilt, which is kind of a sign of a lack of water. So when we're talking about cankers, a canker, as I'm referring it today, is going to be an infectious disease that's caused in the phloem and the cambium of stems, of branches, of twigs. And some patch of tissue there in the vascular system is being killed, and the kind of tissue there is dying as a result. That might progress over time. And here you have, really different examples of what that might look like, from a Utapella canker on a maple, to a Botryosphaeria canker on an oak, to a butternut canker. And all of, this canker is just this general term. So you can have really different appearances and causes. Now, typically, again, this is going to be in that woody tissue, and that tissue death is going to progress over time. So it might start small and get worse. Now, some of these pathogens can act faster, and the death that they've caused might happen faster than others. But this will progress over time, especially with the host response there. And there are many different kinds. Some are going to appear kind of sunken. As the wood kind of continues to grow around that, the part that's impacted, that's been killed, is going to be sunken. Some might be cracked. Others might kind of build up more as you have the tree's defensive response. So the tree is trying to compartmentalize, seal off that fungus or whatever is in there causing that problem. And if it's doing that, it might build up into, a lot of wound response there. These cankers can look very different, or you might not see anything at all unless you peel back the bark and reveal the dead tissue underneath. So lots and lots of different types. And I think a good place to start might be with chestnut blight. And an example of how a pathogen can cause both wilt and canker symptoms. So chestnut blight is, we refer to it as a historical disease, right? And, it's been here for a long time. It's really impacted our forests, especially in the southern Appalachians. But while most of the photos you find of chestnut blight are these historical photos of massive trees, this picture is probably more likely what you're going to see today. Some small trees, maybe more like shrubs really, that are growing either planted in a field like this one, or in a forest understory. And the first symptoms you might notice are the wilt symptoms, the yellowing of branches, flagging, dead branches, and eventual death of that shoot, that trunk. And underneath that, or what you might have to look a little bit more closely to see, is these cankers, this cracked bark, sunken cankers here, where it just looks a little sunken, right? It looks like it's kind of sunken away from the rest of the tissue, and maybe even some of this orange sporulation here. That's a sign of the pathogen that's causing this Cryphonectria parasitica in the vascular system under that bark. And whenever a shoot gets large enough, it gets killed, and more will sprout up from the root system because that's not going to be impacted. And that's why it takes on this shrubby, almost bushy form. So if you look closely, you might also see, here's another photo of the bark cracking, that canker, as well as this distinctive sporulation here. Now this branch is dead, or soon will be, but since the root system isn't killed, another shoot will likely come up, only to be killed again. And over time, this will likely kill the tree. Unless the tree has a lot of light access, it's not going to reproduce. But this is chestnut blight, so this is an invasive pathogen that came in and wiped out chestnut. But that same kind of canker model that we just talked about, you might see in some different ways. So this photo right here is of something that, superficially looks really similar. You've got that sunken, slightly sunken tissue. You have that kind of orange color around those branch wounds, and this is Nectria canker. In particular, coral-spotted nectria canker, which is a different canker, kind of related to chestnut blight, but totally different. And it would impact a wide range of different host species. And it commonly comes in on those pruning wounds, an entry point. And I think of nectar canker as really opportunistic, right? It's taking advantage of those wounds getting in and impacting the vascular system that way. Now, they can also exist as a saprophyte, feeding on the dead material there, but really not at all like the really aggressive, pathogen that we just talked about with chestnut blight. For the most part, while this might get worse over time, it just depends, and trees can live with this for a long time. And now it will kill the bark and the tissue just underneath it, and it can be very hard to manage once it's established because you need to be careful to avoid spreading it around. It doesn't really decay the wood in the way that you might think of as some other wood decay fungi that we'll talk about later. Although those infection sites can then, of course, be a great entry point for other wood decay fungi. So these cankers are going to develop and expand gradually. And each year, kind of what's going to happen is that the fungus that's causing this is going to grow a little bit, and then the tree is going to try to defend itself and seal it off and compartmentalize that and grow to overcome that. And sometimes you might see something like this, a perennial target canker. And what you're seeing here is layers of wound response wood produced each year in response to the fungus that's there. So each year during dormancy, the fungus grows a little bit and damages the tree. And then after that, when the tree is actively growing, it's trying to seal that off and prevent that growth. And you have this kind of arms race that's going on for years and years, which is why you get this kind of target look. That's, years of the tree trying to defend itself from that fungus. How bad is this? Well, it kind of depends. It depends on the situation. If it was a really small shoot to begin with, it certainly could kill that shoot. But it also depends on who's growing faster. Is your fungus doing better, or is your host tree doing better? And in general, these are things that you might observe. This one having existed for many, many years, that fungus and that host together, kind of at a standstill in terms of who's winning and who's losing there. But again, there are many different other types of things that we call cankers out there. Here's a disease called hypoxylin canker, caused by the fungal pathogen Biscognioxia acropunctatum. Now, I guess we should more accurately call it Biscognioxia canker, but honestly, that just doesn't have the same appeal. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue in the same way. But this is a tree that I pass just about every day, and what stands out to me is that this is a very stressed and declining tree. And if you look at it, there's a lot of things that are not going well with it. But then if you were to zoom in and look up into the canopy, what you would see up there is places where the bark has slothed off and exposed this mat of hyphae and sporulation, the hypoxylin canker here. Now, this is a fungus that actually infects trees when they are younger, and it just hangs out and waits in the tree until that tree becomes stressed. So when trees are healthy, it doesn't seem to do much, but once the tree becomes stressed and water pressure in that tree drops, it becomes more active and becomes a problem. So when I see hypoxylin canker in trees, it's a sign to me of dead wood in branches, or if it's on the main trunk, a dead tree, and that kind of decline is advanced. This tree is well on its way to being dead if it's not already. So you'll also find this on logs hanging out, right? So if I see this, to me it's a major red flag, but it's kind of an important point anytime we're talking about tree diseases, is that I don't necessarily think that this is what triggered that stress, but it is certainly happy to be a nail in the coffin of a tree that is going downhill. So when I see this, it's a sign of concern, even if the fact that it's hypoxylin canker doesn't concern me. To me, that's a clear sign that that tree is under a lot of stress and is dying. There are also many other types of cankers. You might see bleeding cankers, which kind of ooze wet spots from the bark. If you were to trim that bark back, what you might see would be dead patches, dead tissue just underneath. Many different organisms can cause that type of canker, and this can vary in terms of the damage it causes, from really minor ephemeral issues. Again, if that tree is able to really actively grow and seal off that damage, seal off whatever is causing it, and compartmentalize that damage, it might not be any big deal. On the other hand, you can have bleeding cankers that are just going to get worse little by little over time, as well as some that are really serious issues that can be lethal to trees. Treatment depends on that causal agent. So, for example, some bleeding cankers are caused by fungi, others might be caused by oomycetes, like Phytophthora. If it is caused, if it's a Phytophthora canker, there are going to be some treatment options out there. Those are going to be within the group that target oomycetes. And if you were to use a fungicide, you would not be so successful. So something to consider there. Another important note, that sometimes the symptoms of cankers might not be as visible on the outside of the branches, but might be observed elsewhere. So here's a photo of a tree with thousand cankers disease. That's a newer invasive disease that's caused by an invasive fungus and an invasive beetle, the walnut twig beetle, that vectors it. Both of these are native to the western part of the US and occur on different walnut species there where they're native and cause minor damage. But when they have encountered black walnut, either because people have planted black walnut outside of its native range, or because humans have accidentally moved the fungus and its vector where it can cause into the range of black walnut, they've caused more damage. And what you might first notice with this is not the cankers, despite the name thousand cankers disease, but the yellowing of the leaves, the canopy thinning, and branch death. And again, these are general symptoms that you might observe for any number of reasons. Lots of things can cause that. But in this case, with thousand cankers disease, if you were to take a closer look and look more closely at some of those branches or twigs, you might notice some very, very tiny holes or cracked bark. But you won't really see the problem unless you trim off that bark, and then you'll see these cankers. This is a very small one, but dead patches of tissue in that vascular system. As you can see from this picture, just one of these, this is nothing. This tree would recover just fine and is a very normal issue. But it's not one of them, it's a thousand cankers disease. So as the name suggests, the problem is just not one or two little dead tissue patches there, but many of them all coalescing to impact that vascular system, to cut off that circulation of water and nutrients there. So this is kind of a more extensive situation of what you might imagine. And so these are caused by those walnut twig beetles. And here's a photo for scale of just how tiny they are. They are really tiny little beetles. But them tunneling in the tree, these repeated tunneling, moving that fungus around, that fungus itself is not going to become systemic and spread through the tree, but each of those repeated introductions is going to move it. Those lesions will grow, those dead patches will grow, and eventually can cut off that circulation if they grow together. And I think this emphasizes to me the point here, this photo again of these tiny little beetles, that unless you're an entomologist, and I know we have some entomologists joining today, you likely won't see these, right? These are tiny. They are little and they're easy to miss. So when we think about preventing the spread of thousand cankers disease or any other number of pathogens or insects, it's really hard to tell if something is infected or infested visually. You would easily miss this and this damage just under the bark. Kind of one of the reasons why preventing the accidental movement of firewood and contaminated materials is so important. So with thousand cankers disease, I wanted to show this map of kind of the states that are known to have thousand cankers disease, both their native range as well as in the eastern U.S., and emphasize that the good news is that with thousand cankers disease, it hasn't spread as rapidly or been as bad for black walnut as was initially thought. That damage, especially in Tennessee, where it was first kind of detected in the eastern U.S., has not progressed in the landscape or in those individual trees in the way that we feared for black walnut. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I'm sure you've heard of thousand cankers disease, and it is a nice example of cankers, but something that should be on your radar. That situation could always change, but hasn't been as bad as we were initially concerned it would be. So with that, I kind of want to transition into talking a little bit about wilts. Because again, what I'm talking about with wilts is a symptom. Lots of different things can cause wilts, including some of the same things that cause cankers. But the wilt is describing the symptom of those droopy leaves and shoots. They lose their kind of water pressure and become droopy. This may be followed by the death of branches or yellowing of foliage and then death of branches. And it could be followed by the death of the tree over time. Now, many different things can cause wilting, and it doesn't have to be a pathogen. You can get wilting from a lack of water. You can get wilting from root problems or from a canker that killed a branch. Anything that's cutting off that flow of water, pretty much. So when you see those wilting symptoms, what it suggests to me is a lack of water availability to that tree. Lots of different things can do that, can result in a lack of water. And for today, we're going to be talking about many different pathogens in the xylem, in the tree's vascular system, as well as the tree's response. Because sometimes it's not just the pathogen in there that's causing the problems, but the tree's attempts to defend itself that shut down the flow of water. So you could have, the fungus in there or things that it's producing. You can have the tree trying to seal off the spread of that fungus, producing tyloses or other things to defend itself that would exacerbate that problem. And just a point that I wanted to make is that, so, it's effectively a water issue in the tree. And so a lot of times when I see these problems first appearing, it is right when we start to hit some hot, dry weather. Now, is that when that fungus is first getting into the tree? No, but it's when that tree is going to really feel that stress, that water stress happening. Especially, if this is a newer issue for it, it might have entered the tree previously, but when you'll start to see those symptoms first emerging is going to be when you hit some hot, dry conditions, and then this would kind of add on to it. So one classic example of a wilt issue would be Dutch elm disease. So that is another invasive pathogen that has really shaped our landscapes, both our urban landscapes and our woodlands, by killing off elm trees. And what you would see symptom-wise with this would be upper branches that are wilting, and wilt a lot of times will start at the top and kind of move its way down. So upper branches that are wilty, droopy, yellow, lose their leaves. Those symptoms are going to move down the tree and eventual tree death. And just kind of another photo of what you might see in some of that foliage of those dead wilt. It looks like it doesn't have enough water to me, right? I don't know if you all would see this and think that as well, but it's just like, this tree is lacking water. And what's going on there is another case where you've got a fungus in the vascular system of the tree that's clogging up the flow of water, as well as the tree's defensive response. And this is another case where that fungus is being vectored by beetles, slightly larger beetles than what we talked about with the walnut twig beetle for thousand cankers disease. But this invasive fungus that is being spread by these beetles that is then getting in the vascular system of the tree and shutting off that flow of water that's so essential, preventing that, as well as the tree's defenses to that. So Dutch elm disease, after its introduction, killed a huge proportion of our elm trees. Now we do still have elm around, and they do still get Dutch elm disease. I see it quite regularly, but there's a lot more resistance naturally occurring with Dutch elm disease than there is to something like chestnut blight. Which is great for us in terms of, being able to have those elms still in the landscape. But let's look at another wilt pathogen, and this disease has wilt in its name, so it's wilty, right? Laurel wilt disease. And again, the first symptoms you might see would be wilty, droopy leaves. In the middle of the summer, right when it starts to get hot, you might see the leaves just losing their kind of turgor, looking kind of less glossy than usual. Then that will progress to early fall color. Where I live in Kentucky, the tree that's being impacted is sassafras. And so sassafras has beautiful bright red and orange fall color. So seeing that in the middle of the summertime, maybe those leaves just drying up entirely, so dead leaves held on the branches, and then dead trees. So laurel wilt disease in general is a newer invasive issue. It's an invasive fungus that's being carried by an invasive red bay ambrosia beetle, so more tiny beetle vectors. Both of these are thought to be native to Asia, and here in North America, they are killing plants in the laurel family, thus the name laurel wilt disease. Now, where I am, that's going to be sassafras and spicebush, but depending on where you're joining from, this might be different species. This might be red bay and others. So just as a new issue that's kind of newer, that's really sweeping through my area right now, and I think it demonstrates some of these common wilt issues, and that what you see are the wilting and the dead leaves in the canopy. But what's actually happening, what's actually causing that, is similar to kind of what we talked about with Dutch elm disease and with thousand cankers disease, and that you have a fungus that's in that vascular system, that's clogging things up, and you also have the tree trying to defend itself. And both of those are cutting off that flow of water to the tree, and that's why you see those wilt symptoms. So if you were to cut into the bark of a sassafras tree that's dying of laurel wilt disease, what you would see is this black streaky staining. It's quite distinctive. And that is going to be that fungus as well as the tree's defensive response to it. Here's just a cross section. You can also see that staining that way because this is a destructive sampling method. So it's something I really only do when that tree is pretty dead or close to it. Something that's different about laurel wilt disease than thousand cankers disease, and I think one of the probably many reasons why it's been so destructive relative to others, is that all it takes is a single introduction of this fungus. You could have one red bay ambrosia beetle, and if it were to arrive and deposit that fungus into the tree, it would become systemic and spread through that tree and kill it. Now that's very different from when we talked about thousand cankers disease, which is 1,000 individual little cankers, little dead necrotic patches there in that tissue. That's not what's happening with laurel wilt disease. It's a very different kind of way that it's acting. And I don't think that is in laurel wilt disease's plans. It's not in its advantage to kill its host rapidly like that. But it's clearly a mismatch of tree defenses compared to its native range. But if you were looking at laurel wilt disease, again, I think you'd have to be an entomologist to see these tiny, tiny little holes that are caused by the red bay ambrosia beetle that's moving that fungus into the tree. And you might see some tiny, tiny little toothpicks as well. This is spice bush, which is another host species in my area. This fungus, ambrosia beetles, are fungus farmers. So they intentionally bring these fungi with them and then eat them. But in this case, that fungus that causes laurel wilt disease, it does not stay put. It does not stay localized to where this beetle is tunneling. It spreads in the tree and becomes systemic and is a big problem. So where is laurel wilt disease right now? Here's a map from last fall of where it's been detected. And you can see that it started here along the coast and spread in red bay laurel, is also a major issue in avocado and in other species. Just more recently, it made its leap over into my neck of the woods, over in Kentucky. And obviously, this did not happen naturally, right? This is something that undoubtedly someone accidentally moved in some contaminated material, some maybe firewood that had laurel wilt disease, or maybe someone that liked the beautiful staining that it causes. Who knows? We're not going to know how it arrived. But I think it's just another kind of emphasis to me of the importance of not moving around wood, lest it accidentally be contaminated with something that you don't want to spread. I think it's really, laurel wilt disease is on the move, especially outside of this range that it has been on in the past, kind of further north and into our hardwoods areas on sassafras and on spicebush. And so we'll have to see what the future holds for that. But it is definitely sad to go to stands with, in our area, we have very large sassafras. We have some, big sassafras trees, and to see 20, 25-inch diameter trees that have been killed by laurel wilt disease is a sad thing. So another wilt that is very common in our landscape settings would be verticillium wilt. Many other pathogens can cause different types of wilt by cutting off the flow of water in the xylem. So verticillium wilt impacts, there are actually several different species that cause verticillium wilt fungi that, again, are going to be in that vascular system of the tree. And you're going to see those wilt symptoms. Now, this might happen gradually over time, but I think the more distinctive way that people think of it is when you see something that looks like it happened all of a sudden. So it just depends. There are different host species that this will impact. I most commonly see it in maples as well as in yellow poplar and others. And what's causing this, again, is going to be below the bark. If you cut into it, one of the ways to find it is going to be if you see that staining, that streak, that black staining in that vascular system. Now, just from my own experience, it's not always that easy to see or that ubiquitous throughout that wood. And it's something that I think once a tree is showing these signs is not going to be something that's going to be able to manage that. You really don't want to spread it to other trees. So we're talking about the need to sanitize equipment and sterilize anything that you're using to prune between different trees. Now, if it's something that's happening more slowly rather than very rapidly, promoting the health of the tree can extend its life. And certainly when it comes to replacing that tree, replacing it with something that's less susceptible. Another wilt pathogen that is not as big of a problem in our area in the southeast, but in other parts of the country, in the Midwest and upper Midwest, is a huge issue, is oak wilt. Another fungal pathogen that impacts the vascular system of trees and will result in, you'll see wilt, you'll see maybe what looks like a sudden death of that tree, but what's actually occurring is the fungus in that vascular system, again, cutting off the flow of water. And oak wilt is lethal to oak trees and is especially damaging to red oaks. Now, what those symptoms look like can be very different in different oak species. So if anyone is joining us from an area with live oaks, you know, that those symptoms are going to look different in live oak. They're going to look different in white oak. But in general, you've got, again, it looks like it's water stressed. You have a leaf scorch from the outside edges in, at least with red oak, that can look like not much. It doesn't look that distinctive, but can be a huge issue. And it's spread a couple different ways. It can be spread naturally through natural root grafts that occur. It can be spread by beetles that are attracted to the sweet smelling hyphal mats that it produces and can spread the fungus and spores that way. And another way that it can be spread, and another thing to keep in mind from a management perspective is that this is an issue in your area. It can be spread during the late spring and summer, accidentally if you're pruning or on pruning wounds. So in those areas, it's recommended to avoid wounding oaks in that late spring, summer time period. To minimize the likelihood that those trees are going to be impacted. But I would also say that, oh yeah, and here's a photo of those hyphal masses and spores that those beetles might be attracted to, might roll around in, and then spread it to a new tree. But I will say that when it comes to oak wilt, I care about oak wilt, and I'm obviously concerned about oak wilt because where I am in Kentucky, oaks are incredibly important. And really for all of us, when we're talking about hardwoods, whether it's in your landscape or in the woods, oaks are very important species. So anything that's impacting an oak, I'm going to be aware of and concerned about. And here's a map if you were to Google where is oak wilt. But I will say that I have never found it in Kentucky. I've never talked to anyone who's found it in Kentucky. Our plant diagnostic labs have never had it in over 20 years of samples. So despite looking like it's all over our state, it is not an issue currently. Now, that could always change, and it certainly is a major issue in other parts of the country, especially in the Midwest, upper Midwest, parts of Texas. Instead, what I see is a whole lot of something that looks quite similar. So on our landscape aging red oaks, instead what I see is tons of bacterial leaf scorch. The symptoms are going to look very similar in terms of leaf scorch from the outside edges in. Again, in this case, it's not a fungus, but a bacterium that is causing problems in that vascular system, gumming things up and preventing that flow of water. This is just incredibly common in the central Kentucky area, and I'm curious to hear from other folks joining if you all see this in your area. I've seen a big increase in this. Now, I do see this associated with tree stress as well. So in our aging, stressed out red oaks in landscape areas is where this is most common. And there's another thing that could be spread around through pruning material. And once a tree has this, there's really not a lot you can do for it other than potentially promote its health and prolong its life. But this kind of emphasizes something that I hope through this wilt section has become apparent, that these foliar symptoms can be misleading, because someone might see this bacterial leaf scorch in the leaves and think, oh, I have a leaf issue. But really what they have is a problem with the vascular system of the tree. And that's much more serious in my mind than an issue on leaves. Nonetheless, I think that's a good time to kind of transition into some of those foliar issues, because there are many of them. And most of them are quite minor. They might look bad, and if you're working in this area like I am, you might get lots and lots of emails about them, but not a serious health concern. They might look bad, but typically not as bad as they look. However, some are a sign of something more significant going wrong, and being able to distinguish those is really key. Is this something that just looks bad, is aesthetic, and is going to go away and not really impact the tree that much? Or is this something that's the sign of something more serious for the health of the tree? So one foliar issue that I've seen a lot more of these past few years has been anthracnose. And anthracnose is a general term for this type of foliar disease that's caused by many different species, and there's lots of different anthracnoses that are caused on different plants by different fungi. But in general, what we're talking about is a fungal necrosis, death of patches of the leaves, and some cases can move into the shoots. And that's where you see the most problems. It's one thing for it to stay in the leaves, and yes, it's not great, and you can get a lot of defoliation that way, and it can stress trees out, but when it moves into the shoots, it can be more problematic. So anthracnose can affect a wide variety of hosts, and weather conditions really impact the severity of the disease, as well as on some hosts you will get worse disease. And I think, at least in my area, we have had a lot more wet weather, and I think that's really driving an increase in anthracnose, especially in some species. So this is one sycamore that the anthracnose the sycamore gets is worse than in other species. Many times you'll see in kind of late spring, early summer, the entire canopy of trees is very thin. It's almost as if it's lost all of its leaves. And if you were to look at those up close, what you would see is this kind of classic anthracnose pattern following these veins along here, where you would imagine that water would pool. And anthracnose really likes kind of cool, wet periods. And I think that we're just seeing a lot wetter weather and getting more of that. And so where I see it as being most problematic, though, is not what it does in the leaves, but when it moves into shoots and will kill those shoot tips, that new growth, and even cause cankers there. So back to our canker discussion. So, you know, a lot of what we're talking about, these are the symptoms that we're seeing. You know, canker, wilt, leaf issues. It's the same pathogen might cause different symptoms on different hosts and different times. So sycamore is one where I have seen a lot more anthracnose issues, both in the leaves, but also moving into the shoots and causing death of those. Dogwood is another species that can be very much impacted by anthracnose. Now, this is a spot anthracnose, so not a major issue here, but if it were to move into those shoots and cause death there, prevent that new growth, it could be a major issue. Now, I've just shown you two species that I think are being more severely impacted by anthracnose. Most of the time, treatment isn't really warranted for anthracnose. There are some fungicides that are possible, but it depends on the tree and the level of severity. And that's really something that needs to be done preventatively before those trees leaf out, not after the trees are already really compromised. So there are many more. There are so many different foliar issues you could talk about, from you know, more serious things to things like this maple tar spot that might look terrible, but really does nothing to negatively affect that tree. That tree is fine. This happens later in the season and doesn't have any measurable negative impact on those trees. So I think being able to distinguish those is key for determining, you know, when, if treatment is possible, or is that a sign of something worse? So again, foliar symptoms can be misleading, and they can include things that might at first glance appear to be foliar, but actually go much deeper. So this is a tree that looks like it's got something going on with the foliage. But if you were to look up close at each one of those tips, what you would see and kind of zoom in even further is Botrosphaeria canker, killing each of those new shoots. And that's why you see that brown foliage, is that that new shoot has been killed by that canker. On the other hand, this is a tree that I've been watching for quite some time now, and each year it gets worse and worse, and it dies back more and more. And even though I'm seeing that in the foliage, only occasionally do I get glimpses into what's really driving that, and that is going to be root issues and things happening below the ground. So every now and then I will see this amazing proliferation of fruiting bodies of mushrooms from its roots and the base of the tree. So most of the time I'm not going to see that, but I am going to see that gradual decline in its leaves and its shoots over time. And that's a kind of segue into talking about rots. So, you know, this is a section where we could talk about this for a long time, and there are many, many different types of rots. A lot of what I'm thinking of are those wood decay fungi, and there are different kinds, whether we're talking about fungi that impact the roots and the butt of the tree, those that might cause rot of the heartwood. You can have rot that comes in on the top of trees if that you've had an ice storm or something. That top rot that would impact the upper part of the tree. And these tend to be very different fungi that would cause you know, that type of rot from something that's going to impact the base of the tree or the root system. There are many different species of fungi that can cause rots, and these would range from being aggressive pathogens that could cause more damage more rapidly to weak pathogens. They might, you know, gradually impact the tree over time, but if the tree is really stressed, could act as a nail in the coffin, to more of those saprophytes and things that are just breaking down dead tissue. And somehow they found themselves inside of this tree, and really there's not that much difference from their perspective, that heartwood and a dead log sitting in the woods. So they kind of span this extent. Many of them are opportunistic and will take advantage of other stresses. And I think the impact that they have and how we think about them is really determined by where our focus is for those trees, and kind of gets us to the importance of context. So if we're talking about trees that are growing in the woods, and I love this old Forest Service photo of a tree that has, just a little sign. If you had the whole tree here, you would see this slight fire scar here maybe. It doesn't look like much. The tree is probably in great condition and growing really well. But once it is cut open, you can see just how extensive that decay is on the inside. Now, is this negatively impacting the health of that individual tree? I mean, you can see that it's been really actively growing. This outside part, which is going to be that actively growing part of that tree, it's doing well. And that tree would probably live much longer than I would if it were left standing. Now, maybe not the health of the tree, but from a timber perspective, very little value. And certainly, if you are concerned about tree risk, that could be a big impact. So this is a tree that I saw earlier or later last year that had fallen on a neighbor's house. And I think distinctive, I mean, the tree has a relatively full canopy, but had a lot of decay in the heartwood in the tree. And you can even see fruiting bodies there. It was entirely hollow. So from a structural issue, major problem. From a tree risk issue, major problem. And there are many different types of rots and decays, and our time is already pretty much out, so we won't get to discuss them with any depth. But some of the more common ones that I see are things like armillaria root rot, which, if you're really lucky in the fall, you might catch the fruiting bodies and mushrooms of armillaria. That would, be a dead giveaway. But more frequently, what I might see would be these hardened rhizomorphs in decaying wood, or maybe mycelial fanning just under the bark, these white mycelia that are growing there, causing that wood decay and also impacting the tree. And a lot of other fungi from Ganoderma species. Now this is a tree that you can see just how decayed it is. But what you can't see in this photo is that this is a recent construction site. So this tree, the soil around it had been very compacted. That tree undoubtedly had been repeatedly wounded and nicked up at its base, which is a perfect entry point for decay fungi, those wounds. And there are many, many more. Really, what is important with these fungi, in my opinion, is learning to distinguish those that have the potential to cause more damage and act more rapidly from those that are more signs of deadwood or not serious problems. While it's never great to see mushrooms fruiting from wood, being able to distinguish those two can tell you a lot about what's happening inside of the tree. That you might not be able to see. For example, if I were to see these mushrooms on the side of the tree, these are oyster mushrooms, am I concerned? Yes, because those fruit from dead wood. So that tells me something about that tree, and it's nothing good. But at the same time, I don't consider them pathogens. I don't think that this is a risk to neighboring trees or that tree necessarily, other than telling me, hey, there's some pockets of dead wood in there. I wonder what that means about the health of the tree. So being able to distinguish those pathogens from signs of dead wood. And then I just kind of wanted to briefly mention that declines. So I've mentioned declines, and I've used this term repeatedly through this presentation, but it's a slippery term, and it means different things in different contexts. Typically, it's used as a term of convenience and communicating to describe a general decline of a tree or a group of trees over time due to many different compounding factors. So there are lots of different types of declines and different definitions of declines. I'm partial to the idea of a decline spiral, so that you have predisposing factors that kind of set the stage for decline. You have an inciting factor, a trigger for things getting worse, and then you have lots of contributing factors, those nails in the coffin for trees. And just a point that when people talk about decline in individual trees in the landscape versus trees in the forest, it's a very different thing. So let's take the example of oak decline, since it's in my backyard and I'm familiar with it. In the kind of central hardwoods context, you have a predisposing factor, so the sage is set for decline. You might have poor site conditions. You might have tree health conditions, old red oaks in the case of oak decline. Then you have some inciting factors, a triggering event, a drought, defoliating insects, injury, especially if you're in an urban landscape, that really stresses that tree out more. And then you have lots of contributing factors, these nails in the coffin, different fungi and insects that over time are going to cause that progression and things to get worse and worse. And basically, you're circling the drain. That is what this photo is meant to represent, is that it is coming, that tree death is coming. It's just going to take time. And in my area, what I see most commonly for these inciting, contributing, and predisposing factors would be things like drought for an inciting factor. And then lots and lots of different contributing factors, things like root rot. We just talked about, armillaria root rot, but many different root rots that might cause trees to tip over and but these trees were already stressed. Or that hypoxylin canker that I mentioned earlier, that will all be part of this kind of compounding death spiral for trees. Or insects like the two-line chestnut borer. So I know that was a lot of information that we just covered, but hopefully it gave you some different things to think about in terms of diseases that hardwoods typically get. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about management after, but I know I've reached the end of my time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. And thank you all for joining today.
Dr. Crocker, somehow you achieved the impossible and covered just an unbelievable amount of information in a cogent and thorough way. Thank you so much for putting that together for us today. That was remarkable. We've already had, we have a full house here today. We have so many people who are asking for the recording too. So thank you for your contribution to our forest health community. We do have a list of questions. I'm just going to go because we're already at 11 or already at 2 now. And I'm just going to go through a couple that I got several times. And then folks, if you do have a pressing question that we didn't get to, please do email it to me and we'll do our best to get that answered and redirect it back to you. Thank you again, Dr. Crocker. Do you have time for just about, let's say, 4 more minutes for a Q&A?
Oh, of course, of course. And, I encourage folks to reach out to me if they have other questions as well that we don't have time for. Happy to chat more.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that offer. I will put Dr. Crocker's email address into the chat box as well.
And I do realize that we have a broad group of folks today, and some of you might have great expertise with some of the things that I talked about, and I just scratched the surface on. And so I think that just speaks to the expertise that is available to those of you that are just thinking about this for the first time. Your local expertise is going to be the best, because what I see in Kentucky is going to be different from what you might see even just across the border in Tennessee or further south. So being familiar with what are the common local issues that you're seeing is really valuable. Hopefully this whirlwind tour of some different diseases was helpful in getting you started.
Absolutely. That's a great point too. There were several, I wish we could address all of them. There were several really interesting comments coming through. Someone chimed in, Dr. Crocker, and this person left me their email address for follow-up, but someone actually received nuts from American chestnut trees, with blight resistance from upstate New York
Oh,
and
great.
planted them. They're still in pots and need to be transplanted, but they were advised not to plant near Chinese chestnut trees. And then they were just wondering if you had any additional management strategies to contribute to planting resistant saplings that they have generated, which I just is super rare and incredible that you're able to do that.
Well, I'll say a couple of different things. First off, if you're interested in chestnut, I think that everything about restoring chestnut to our woods is really exciting to me, because when I think about the health of these systems, there's been a lot of things that have changed in the life of these woods, but the absence of chestnut has got to be huge, not just for plant life, but for all the wildlife that depend on them. So I think this idea of bringing chestnut back into our landscapes is fantastic. And if you're interested in this, I really encourage you to reach out to the American Chestnut Foundation. They have a lot going on in this realm in terms of promoting, chestnut and its restoration. Now, breeding efforts to restore chestnut have taken, people are trying different tools in the toolbox. So there's a lot of different ways that people have done that. So when someone tells me they have resistant American chestnut, one of my first questions would be, what does that mean, and what do they actually have? Because most of the time, there isn't resistant pure American stock available. What we have are some Americans that are still out there in the wild that have either been really lucky and have escaped it. Maybe they're growing in a high light situation and they can reproduce. They can make burrs with nuts because they can grow. Chestnut grows so fast, and so if it has access to light, it can do that. And if it can be pollinated, it can do that. And it, but that might not necessarily be resistant. It might just be lucky. Now, there are hybrids between American and Chinese chestnut that have some degree of resistance. Now, they might still get chestnut blight, and they won't grow like a big, beautiful American chestnut would. It won't be this dominant tree. Nonetheless, I think that's what a lot of the trees that people are planting currently available now are hybrid American Chinese trees. They can still get the blight, but hopefully less of it. Now, and they're going to be different from American, but they do have some of that American gene pool. The other kind of thing to watch for in the future that's coming is the work that State University of New York, SUNY ESF has been doing with a transgenic chestnut. So bringing a gene from wheat, putting it into American chestnut and getting a tree that truly is resistant. And to the best of my knowledge, there aren't any of those available currently. That's still in various stages of approval, but it will be really exciting to see because those are true, pure Americans that are resistant. And I think there's been really good work done to kind of look at how is that going to impact fungal communities and amphibians and others, and it all seems really promising. Anyways, this is the long-winded way of saying that it depends. It depends on what they have. Is it truly blight resistant or not? It's probably going to get blight. And then there are other diseases. Chestnut is the one that we know about. Chestnut blight is the one that we know about. Phytophthora cinnamomii is another invasive oomycete pathogen that can kill chestnut, and it will particularly impact those newly planted trees. With Phytophthora cinnamomii, it is really widespread in our landscapes, and so thinking about sites that are going to be more conducive to the growth of the tree and less conducive to the growth of that pathogen. Well-drained areas, promoting the health of that tree. There's a lot more that we could talk about with that, and I don't even know if I answered your initial question,
You did,
Dr. Dar.
you did. Those were such crucial clarifications, and they were definitely things like when you hear drips and drabs coming in from just the general community, you're not really sure what the most current iteration is and even what the different genomic responses have been. So I really appreciate you offering those clarifications, and you touched on something that several of our participants, yes, I will post Ellen's email again. Several of our participants added to the chat box about the American chestnut developed by SUNY ESF researchers. Yeah, somebody said, Tom Brochu, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, said that they have not yet received USDA approval for release to growers outside of their controlled research plots. Okay, and that's what Dr.
And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
imagine even when they do get those, it'll be a very different situation. It won't be a seed from a tree. It'll be a grafted a grafted individual. If I, like or pollen maybe pollen from one of those very special trees that they have. But if you are interested in growing American chestnut or American Chinese hybrids, there's a lot of great work on how to do that, both in terms of site prep and silvicultural options. So, giving them access to the amount of light that they need so they can really take off and produce spurs, to things like packing them with mud, packing those potential cankers with mud, other things to reduce the blight potential there. But I would encourage people to think not just about blight, but also about cinnamomum and other things that they might get.
yeah, true enough. Um, okay, I'll just throw out one more. Guys, I am so sorry. We have so many great questions here. If they were pressing questions, I urge you to email them to me directly and we will get to the bottom of them. I'm sorry we just didn't have a chance. This was such a broad topic. To have a comprehensive Q&A at the end here. Dr. Crocker has already been so generous with her time. This kind of plays off of just the last one, and this is a pretty general question, Ellen, but someone asked, does thousand cankers disease only affect walnut?
Yeah, to my knowledge, it's only impacting walnut. And I think that's a maybe something to discuss is kind of host range and, how many different species are going to be impacted by some of the diseases that we talked about, because some of them have these really, really broad host ranges, but maybe it's not all equal on all of those. So I mentioned bacterial leaf scorch, and I see from the chat a few people saying, yes, I'm seeing this where I am too. Bacterial leaf scorch, the bacterium that causes that has a huge host range, huge, 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 many, many different plant species, but it's not gonna be the same on all of them. So in my area, I see it most problematic on aging, stressed out red oaks. But in other areas, there might be variation in what's present there, both from the pathogen side and also the host side. When it comes to things like laurel wilt disease, that's going to impact the Laraceae plants in that family. It's not going to jump over to oak, fortunately, or something else, something entirely unrelated. It's going to be more specialized there. And so thinking about the potential of some of these pathogens to impact other plants in your landscape or woods, that's one consideration I'd have. Frequently, when I get questions from woodland owners about, I've got this disease and it's present in all of my trees and they're all dying. To me, that's a really red flag, not necessarily for an individual pathogen or insect, but more kind of like what's going on with that site? Like what's happening there? What's the history of that site that's causing that? Versus is there something that's taking out all their trees? While that is possible, more often what I would see are kind of site issues that have really impacted things.
That's such a good point. That's such a good point. Gosh, I could listen to you for the rest of the day. Thank you. This has been so fascinating.
Thank you.
No, you're such a talented teacher. Thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning. And again, just tackling just pretty much the broadest topic that we could have hurled at you, Dr. Crocker. We are so lucky to have you as our premier speaker for this spring webinar series. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and again, it's a topic. It's tough to talk about so many different things at once without just barely scratching the surface, which is hopefully what we did today. But for any one of these issues that we discussed, there are fantastic resources that are available. For example, we just briefly ran through rot and decay fungi, but there's a fantastic new book out by Florida ISA and some of the pathologists there at University of Florida on wood decay fungi that I've already been reading and really enjoying. And so, just make sure that you check out some of those resources to go in greater depth on some of these topics. There's
That's
some
a
really
great
good
tip.
information out there.
I'll post more information to that on our webinar portal because I just not jotted that down for my own reference too. So thank you. That's perfect. That's going to be so great for our
Yeah,
audience.
and they didn't pay me anything, but I do very much like your book, so thank you.
Hey, there you go. Thank you all so much. Again, I'm so sorry we didn't get to your questions, but you should be able to find both of our contact information in the chat box, and anything that I can't answer, I will certainly pass along to Dr. Crocker. Dr. Crocker, thank you so much for your time today. We've already ran over, so